Alright, let's do it. Let's talk Halloween. And whether Christians have any part in it, and is it even a pagan festival in origin? Some people, the answer is immediately, no, Christians shouldn't, and yes, it is pagan. The end. End of discussion. They won't even think about anything else. And then on the other hand, you've got people just like, who cares? Do you like? It's just kids dressing up as their favourite Disney characters or something. Bruh. So how can that be evil? Here in the UK, Halloween's not really a huge deal. I mean, people go out. It's an excuse to party and dress up, usually by adults. And in America, it seems to be such a massive thing. But it doesn't really originate there. But the modern conception of it seems to be more of an American thing. Commercialization and all that. I mean, same for Christmas and Easter, really. It's America likes to make things business. But regardless of that, the modern conception has taken on this sort of myth of pagan Celtic roots and exaggerated any of the folklore and tradition that's come down from the Middle Ages, and it's become this great big thing that's centered around ghouls and goblins, ghosts and skeletons and all that. And you see it in all the horror films that come out this time of year, the costumes that people can dress up in that are quite evil looking. So just on the face of that, it looks like something that we should not have any part in as Christ following people. But it's not always been that way. And in its origins, like the name even, comes from a Christian festival called All Hallows Eve. And hallow being the Old English word for holy. So it's a holy eve, the evening before November 1st, which is All Saints' Day, a day to remember the martyrs of the faith, people who have died and been put to death for being Christians. And this is the reason we have Christmas Eve and things like that, because as festivals were on the next day, the night before was often a day to go to church and celebrate and worship together in sort of preparation for the next day. So that's why we have Hallows Eve for All Hallows Day, All Saints Day, and we have Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. So there's a pattern, and that's why it's called that. And then over the years, the words have contracted and blah, 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 and we get Halloween, which is Hallows Eve, Halloween. So there you go. So All Saints' Day has a long history starting around the 2nd century in a sort of more basic, primitive form of Christians would remember martyrs. No one cared about birthdays, that was a Roman thing. But they would remember your martyrdom, your death day. So every year people would celebrate the day someone who was martyred died, and they would remember their day, celebrate their life, things like that. Back in 135 AD, we have a text called the Martyrdom of Polycarp. And Polycarp was a famous disciple of the Apostle John. He wrote to the Philippians, and so he was quite prominent back then. And the text that details his martyrdom talks about how the believers, when he was burnt at the stake, they gathered his bones and took them away as sort of precious relics. And we see more references through time in 250, 370, 400 of people writing about this practice, saying, remember the days that people die for their faith, celebrate them, make note of them, so every year we can commemorate it. So this is why we have in liturgical calendars different holy days for different saints and things like that, to remember the feast day of so-and-so, because that's where this comes from, is remembering the day they died. But as persecution spread, more people died, like a lot more people died, more than people could keep track of, really. So that's what eventually led up to, in the 7th century, Pope Boniface IV declared All Saints' Day, so sort of a catch-all for everyone who's died, rather than having individualized days and memories for different people. They can just say, right, everyone is celebrated generally under All Saints' Day, even if they still do it throughout the year on different days. If there's people that have been missed or forgotten or known about, it's sort of like, kind of like that grave to the unknown soldier that's quite famous, you know, it sort of symbolizes all soldiers that died. So All Saints' Day is to sort of catch all, everyone who was martyred. So in Rome, there's a place called the Pantheon, which was a big temple to the Roman gods, the pantheon of gods. And in the 7th century, the Pope Boniface I mentioned, he consecrated it as a church, and it became the name St. Mary of the Martyrs. And this was consecrated on May the 13th. And this was declared to be the festival date to commemorate all of the holy martyrs who died. So this became All Saints' Day. Now take note, that date is May the 13th in the 7th century, not November, not the end of October, nothing to do with autumn or end of seasons or anything like that. It was just the day that they consecrated the Pantheon and tied that together with this commemoration as a yearly event. And this was the Feast of the Holy Martyrs. Then in 835, Pope Gregory IV dedicated and consecrated St. Peter's Basilica, and this is when he extended the Feast of the Holy Martyrs to be all saints who had died, because, like I said before, more people were dying than you could keep track of. So instead of just celebrating people who were martyred, it was anyone who had died that was of the faithful that you wanted to remember. So it became All Saints, and this was the date, which ended up being November the 1st in 830-ish, 835. So that's when the date got moved from May to November, because it was to fall in line with the consecration of this new church. But what about the pagan roots, I hear you say? And Samhain, the Celtic holiday that's often proclaimed to be the origins of Halloween. So as the story goes, Samhain, which is an ancient Gaelic word meaning end of summer, originated 2,000 years ago in Ireland, and Pope came along and said, oh, we can't have this, we'll just slap a new festival on top and call it All Saints instead of whatever they celebrated to the dead. We'll celebrate Christian dead instead. But that's not really how the story goes. And if it were, then there would be more documentation throughout history that shows that the church was aware of some pagan festival to the dead that they then Christianized and made converts, and some back and forth, which, as a sort of side note, we see this sort of debate around Christmas traditions and the celebration of Nativity getting sort of mixed up with, or trying to be separate from, the pagan festivities that happened around the same time. So if there was an overlap, it would have been spoken about. But the All Saints celebrations, as I've said, started in like Turkey and Syria with Polycarp. Even if they weren't widespread and were more localized festivals, over time they grew out of that up to the 6th, 7th, 8th century, when the popes consecrated churches and made the day in May, then moved it to November. But they did this because it was a pre-existing festival that had been happening for centuries, and those dates just happened to be when they consecrated a new church. Nothing to do with anything else, and especially nothing Irish or pagan. Now, the interesting thing is we have sources from 830 AD in Ireland which talks about the Feast of All Saints for the whole of Europe, which was actually celebrated on April 20th around this time. So this was closely to when the Pope changed the date to November the 1st. Obviously, that was in Rome. These guys were in Ireland. It took time for news to travel back then. So they were still, well, I don't know why they were doing it on April 20th, because the original date was May 13th. So you see, there was numerous dates going on. News hadn't got to Ireland by that point, and they were still doing it in April. And if we look at ancient Irish sources and scholarship, the name, the word Samhain and that festival and everything connected to it doesn't appear in Irish folklore until the 10th century. So a good 200 years after we have records that the church was already celebrating All Saints in Ireland, and on a different day as well. So even if Samhain was at the end of October, the date of All Saints was in April in Ireland, and then moved later to November. But that was to do with consecration in Rome and nothing to do with paganism.